When a $200 million deal hangs by a thread at 11 p.m. on a Friday night, most CEOs would call their lawyers. Victoria Chen sat frozen in her corner office, watching her company's future dissolve with each unanswered phone call. Her star translator had vanished 3 hours before the most important meeting of her life. The Japanese executives waiting in Tokyo would only negotiate in an ancient dialect that seemed impossible to find in all of Manhattan. Then came the soft sound of wheels rolling down the empty hallway. Sometimes salvation arrives pushing a janitor's cart, speaking words in a forgotten language that nobody expected. The glass towers of Manhattan never sleep. But on this particular Friday night, the 47th floor of Chen Technologies felt like a tomb. Victoria had built her empire from nothing, transforming a small startup into a $500 million artificial intelligence company. Tonight, everything she had worked for hung in the balance. The Yamamoto Industries deal would either catapult her company into the stratosphere or leave it vulnerable to hostile takeover by her ruthless competitor, Brendan Walsh. She pressed her palms against the cool glass window, watching the city lights blur through her exhaustion. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman who had revolutionized language processing software couldn't find a single human being to translate the most important conversation of her career. David Morrison had been her ace in the hole for 3 years running. The 60-year-old linguistics professor moonlighted as a corporate translator, one of only 3 people on the East Coast who spoke the ancient Kansai dialect fluently. Victoria had paid him a premium to be available tonight, knowing that old Takashi Yamamoto insisted on conducting serious negotiations in his grandfather's tongue. It was a cultural test that separated serious partners from opportunistic foreigners. Morrison understood this. Morrison was supposed to be here. Instead, his phone went straight to voicemail, his hotel room was empty, and her assistant had confirmed that he'd checked out hours ago without explanation. The cleaning crew usually finished the lower floors first, working their way up through the building like a slow tide. Victoria barely noticed them most nights, these invisible workers who maintained the gleaming facade of her success. But tonight, as panic clawed at her chest and desperation made her hyper-aware of every sound, she heard the soft squeak of wheels approaching her office. The door was open, as always when she worked late. She believed in accessibility, in being seen as approachable by her employees, though she wondered now if any of them had ever truly seen her as anything more than a figure behind glass walls. James Sullivan had been pushing that same cart through these hallways for 2 years. Jimmy to his co-workers, Mr. Sullivan to the few executives who bothered to acknowledge him. He'd perfected the art of invisibility, moving through the corporate world like a ghost in blue coveralls. Most nights, he worked in peaceful solitude, listening to podcasts about linguistics and literature, while he emptied trash cans and mopped floors. His 8-year-old daughter Emma was safely asleep at his mother's house in Queens, her homework done and her lunch packed for tomorrow. This job paid the bills, kept them afloat, and allowed him to maintain the fiction that their reduced circumstances were temporary. He paused outside Victoria's office, recognizing the particular quality of distress in her voice as she spoke rapidly into her phone. Jimmy had developed an ear for human emotion over the years, the way some people could identify bird calls or car engines. Frustration had a different pitch than anger. Desperation carried a tremor that mere stress did not. He'd heard every variation during his 2 years here, from junior executives crying over missed promotions to senior partners raging about lost clients. But Victoria's voice tonight held something he rarely encountered in these glass towers: genuine fear. She was switching between English and what sounded like rudimentary Japanese, her pronunciation stilted and formal. "Yamamoto-san, please understand, we are experiencing a technical difficulty," she was saying, her voice tight with controlled panic. "The translator will be available shortly. Yes, I understand the time difference. Yes, I know how important this is." The line went quiet, and Jimmy heard her phone clatter onto the desk. When he glanced through the open doorway, he saw her with her head in her hands, shoulders shaking. Without thinking, he knocked gently on the doorframe. She looked up with red-rimmed eyes that seemed surprised to see him, as if she'd forgotten other people existed in her sphere of crisis. "Sorry to disturb you, ma'am," Jimmy said quietly, his Queen's accent soft and unassuming. Couldn't help but notice you might need some coffee. Looks like it's going to be a long night. He gestured toward his cart, where he kept a small thermos for his own breaks. Victoria stared at him for a moment, processing his presence as if he were an optical illusion. In 2 years of late nights, she had never actually spoken to him beyond polite nods that constituted acknowledgement between different social spheres. Thank you, she said finally, her voice hoarse from hours of phone calls. That's very kind. There was something in her tone that suggested genuine surprise, as if kindness from someone in his position was unexpected. Jimmy poured coffee into a clean mug from his cart, noting how she watched his movements, with the careful attention of someone reassessing their environment. He'd seen that look before. Usually when people realized that the invisible man pushing the cart might have thoughts and opinions of his own. Most of the time it led to awkward overcompensation. But Victoria's exhaustion seemed to have stripped away her professional polish, leaving something more authentic underneath. "Rough night?" he asked, setting the mug on her desk with the easy manner of someone accustomed to serving others. "Sounds like you're missing someone important." It was a gentle probe, the kind of conversational opener that invited confidence without demanding it. Jimmy had learned this skill from years of being simultaneously present and invisible, watching how people behaved when they thought no one was really listening. Victoria wrapped her hands around the warm mug like a lifeline, breathing in the steam as if it might carry solutions along with caffeine. She studied his face, perhaps noting for the first time that his eyes held more intelligence than his position suggested. "My translator disappeared," she said, the words tumbling out with relief. 3 hours before the most important meeting of my career. The client only speaks an ancient Japanese dialect, and I can't find anyone else who knows it." She laughed bitterly, a sound that held no humor. "Turns out money can't buy everything, even in Manhattan." Jimmy nodded sympathetically, though something shifted behind his eyes at the mention of Japanese dialects. He kept his expression neutral, professionally concerned but not overly curious. "That's tough," he said carefully. "The Japanese is tricky even for professional translators, lots of regional variations." He paused, seeming to consider something. "What kind of dialect, if you don't mind me asking?" Victoria looked up sharply, perhaps hearing something in his tone that suggested more than casual interest. But desperation made her less cautious than usual, and she needed to talk through her problem with someone, even if that someone was a janitor who had no power to solve it. "Kansai, apparently," she said, watching his face for any flicker of recognition. "The old version, not modern Osaka dialect. The client's grandfather spoke it, and he considers it a mark of respect when business partners make the effort." She gestured helplessly at her phone. "Morrison was supposed to handle it. Now, I'm looking at losing a $200 million deal because I can't find someone who speaks a dying language." Jimmy's eyebrows rose slightly, and for a moment Victoria thought she saw something like surprise cross his features. But it passed so quickly she might have imagined it. $200 million, Jimmy repeated softly, as if testing the weight of numbers that large. That's a lot riding on words." He moved around her desk, emptying her wastebasket with methodical efficiency. But Victoria noticed that his movement seemed less automatic now, as if part of his attention was focused elsewhere. "You tried the universities? Sometimes the language departments have graduate students who specialize in historical dialects." It was a reasonable suggestion, delivered in the same helpful tone he might use to recommend a good restaurant. "Called them all," Victoria said wearily. "Columbia, NYU, even Princeton. Anyone who might know it is either out of town, unavailable, or booked solid." She rubbed her temples, feeling the beginnings of a tension headache. "I'm starting to think Morrison was my only option, which makes his disappearance even more suspicious." She glanced up at Jimmy, noting how he paused at the mention of Columbia. "My competitor would love to see this deal fall through. Brendan Walsh plays dirty when he wants something." Jimmy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Victoria caught a flash of something that looked like recognition. "People like that usually get what's coming to them," Jimmy said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that seemed at odds with his mild demeanor. "Sorry, that's probably not helpful." He straightened up, pushing his cart toward the door, as if preparing to leave her to her crisis. But he hesitated at the threshold, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. Victoria watched him, noting the way his shoulders tensed and released, as if he were carrying a weight she couldn't see. When he turned back to face her, there was something different in his expression, a resolve that hadn't been there moments before. "Look, this might sound crazy," he said, his voice careful and measured, "but I picked up some Japanese back in the day. I mean, I'm no professional or anything, but—" He trailed off, as if suddenly aware of how presumptuous his offer might sound. "Maybe I could help with a test call, just to see if you've got any options while you keep looking for a real translator?" The suggestion hung in the air between them, preposterous and desperate in equal measure. The silence stretched between them, filled with the hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of traffic 47 floors below. Victoria's analytical mind raced through the implications of accepting help from a janitor for the most important business deal of her career. The professional part of her recoiled at the idea, imagining how it would look if word got out. But desperation has a way of reshaping perspective, and she found herself considering possibilities that would have seemed absurd just hours earlier. What did she really have to lose at this point? "You speak Japanese?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. There was something about Jimmy's offer that felt both spontaneous and calculated, as if he'd been waiting for the right moment to reveal this unexpected skill. Victoria had built her career on reading people, on identifying the gaps between what they said and what they meant. She sensed layers in Jimmy that she'd never bothered to explore before. "How well are we talking? Tourist phrases or actual conversation?" Her tone was businesslike but not dismissive. "Enough to get by," Jimmy said with characteristic understatement. "Spent some time overseas when I was younger, picked up the language, never really lost it." He shrugged as if linguistic fluency were a minor hobby. Kansai dialect's a bit different from standard Japanese, but the basics are the same: grammar, sentence structure, cultural context. Sent another flicker of surprise across Victoria's features. Most amateur language students focused on vocabulary and pronunciation, treating communication as simple word substitution. Victoria's phone buzzed with another message from Yamamoto's assistant, reminding her that the meeting was scheduled to begin in 90 minutes. The weight of that deadline pressed against her chest like a physical force. She looked at Jimmy again, trying to reconcile his humble appearance with the possibility that he might possess the exact skill she desperately needed. Her rational mind catalogued all the ways this could go wrong, but her intuitive side whispered that Jimmy was more than he appeared to be. "What would you need to do a test call?" she asked finally, her voice betraying none of the hope and fear warring in her chest. "Just to see if you can actually communicate with them?" Jimmy's expression remained carefully neutral, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of what might have been relief or anticipation. He moved his cart aside and approached her desk with a different kind of confidence, as if stepping into a role he'd been preparing for without realizing it. "Just need the number and maybe a quick briefing on what kind of business you're discussing," Jimmy said, his voice taking on a more professional tone. Cultural context matters in Japanese business. Formality levels, proper honorifics, appropriate ways to address different hierarchical positions. He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Yamamoto Industries is old school, traditional. If I'm going to represent your company, even temporarily, I need to understand the stakes and the players involved." The way he spoke about honorifics and hierarchical positions suggested knowledge that went far beyond casual language acquisition. Victoria felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest, though she tried to keep her expectations manageable. Even if Jimmy could manage basic communication, there was no guarantee he could handle complex business terminology. But he was here, he was willing, and he seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. She pulled up Yamamoto's contact information on her computer, noting how Jimmy positioned himself to see the screen without being asked. "Yamamoto Industries is a manufacturing conglomerate," she began, settling into explanation mode. "Third-generation family business, very traditional in their approach to partnerships. The deal involves licensing our artificial intelligence software for their automated manufacturing systems." She pulled up financial projections and technical specifications, watching Jimmy's face for signs of confusion. Instead, she saw focused attention and what looked like genuine comprehension. AI integration for manufacturing automation, Jenny repeated thoughtfully. That's complex stuff. A lot of technical terminology, safety considerations, quality control protocols. He studied the documents with careful attention. What's your competitive advantage? What makes your software worth $200 million to them? The question was astute, cutting straight to the heart of the value proposition that Victoria would need to communicate effectively. Victoria found herself explaining her company's innovations with more enthusiasm than she'd felt all evening. Their software wasn't just about automation efficiency. It was about adaptive learning systems that could predict and prevent manufacturing defects before they occurred. As she spoke, she noticed Jimmy asking increasingly sophisticated follow-up questions, demonstrating understanding of concepts that should have been completely foreign to someone in his position. Smart approach, he said finally. Japanese companies value long-term thinking and risk mitigation. Yamamoto will appreciate technology that prevents problems rather than just solving them after they occur. He looked up from the screen, meeting Victoria's eyes directly. Cultural note. When you present this, emphasize the harmony between human workers and AI systems. Traditional Japanese business philosophy values balance and cooperation over replacement and disruption. The insight was sophisticated, demonstrating understanding not just of language, but of cultural frameworks that shaped Japanese business decisions. All right, she said, reaching for her phone. Let's try a test call with Yamamoto's assistant. She dialed the number, activating the speaker function so Jimmy could hear both sides of the conversation. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the phone rang. When a voice answered in rapid Japanese, Victoria felt her stomach clench with familiar helplessness. Jimmy stepped forward and responded with fluid confidence, his pronunciation crisp and his tone appropriately formal. Victoria couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the respect and professionalism in his voice. The conversation flowed naturally, with Jimmy asking questions and providing explanations that seemed to satisfy the person on the other end. When he switched to what must have been Kansai dialect, his voice took on a slightly different quality, warmer and more personal. The call lasted nearly 10 minutes, far longer than Victoria had expected for a simple test. Jimmy's side of the conversation grew increasingly complex, incorporating what sounded like technical terminology and detailed scheduling discussions. He took notes, writing in what appeared to be Japanese characters alongside English translations. When he finally ended the call, Victoria realized she'd been holding her breath for most of the conversation. "Well?" she asked, though his confident smile already suggested success. "What did they say?" Jimmy set down his pen and looked at her with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with something that might have been amusement. There was a different quality to his presence now, as if the phone call had allowed him to shed some protective layer of invisibility. "They're ready when you are," Jimmy said simply. "I explained the situation with your regular translator, told them you had backup language support available. They appreciated the honesty." He gestured to his notes. "Yamamoto-san himself will be joining the call, along with 2 senior executives and their technical team. They want to focus on implementation timelines and integration protocols, but they also want to discuss your company's long-term vision for the partnership." Victoria felt a surge of relief so powerful it left her momentarily lightheaded. Against all odds, the man pushing a janitor's cart through her hallways had just salvaged her most important business deal. But relief was quickly followed by new anxiety as she realized the magnitude of what she was contemplating. Allowing Jimmy to handle basic communication was one thing. Relying on him for complex negotiations involving hundreds of millions of dollars was quite another. "Jimmy," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Can you really handle a full business negotiation in Kansai dialect? Because if we start this meeting and you can't deliver, it's not just my company that suffers. Yamamoto Industries will lose face, and that's something they don't forgive." The warning was delivered without accusation, but with the gravity of someone who understood the cultural implications of failure. Jimmy met her gaze steadily, and for a moment, Victoria glimpsed something in his eyes that reminded her of her own reflection during crucial board meetings. The calm confidence of someone who had faced high-pressure situations before. "I can handle it," he said quietly. "But I think you should know that this isn't the first time I've done something like this." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I used to have a different kind of job before." The admission hung between them, raising more questions than it answered, but somehow providing the reassurance Victoria needed. Before she could probe deeper, Victoria's computer chimed with an incoming video call from Yamamoto Industries. The meeting was beginning 15 minutes early, which could indicate either eagerness or impatience. Either way, there was no more time for explanations. Victoria looked at Jimmy, noting how he straightened his shoulders and assumed a more formal posture, as if preparing for a performance he'd given many times before. "Ready?" she asked, her finger hovering over the accept button. Jimmy nodded, moving to position himself where the camera could capture both of them. Victoria noticed he'd somehow managed to make his casual work clothes look more presentable, and his entire demeanor had shifted from humble service worker to professional consultant. The transformation was so complete that she wondered if she'd ever really seen him clearly before. The screen filled with the familiar conference room of Yamamoto Industries, where four serious-faced executives sat around a polished table. Takashi Yamamoto occupied the central position, his silver hair immaculately styled and his expression revealing nothing. As Victoria began her standard opening pleasantries in halting Japanese, she felt Jimmy's presence beside her like a lifeline. When Yamamoto responded in rapid Kansai dialect, Jimmy stepped forward with fluid grace and answered in the same linguistic style. The effect on the Japanese executives was immediate and visible. Surprised approval replaced polite skepticism, and Yamamoto's stern expression softened into something appropriate warmth. Jimmy's pronunciation was flawless, his cultural references appropriate, and his business vocabulary extensive enough to handle complex technical discussions without hesitation. For the next hour, Victoria watched in growing amazement as Jimmy not only translated her company's value proposition, but enhanced it with cultural insights that resonated powerfully with the Japanese team. He explained their AI technology in terms that emphasized harmony and continuous improvement, concepts central to Japanese manufacturing philosophy. When technical questions arose, he demonstrated understanding of both the software capabilities and the manufacturing processes they would support. Most remarkably, he seemed to anticipate potential concerns before they were voiced. The meeting was proceeding better than any of Victoria's previous negotiations with international clients. Yamamoto's team was engaged, asking detailed questions and providing positive feedback. Jimmy fielded every inquiry with confidence and cultural appropriateness, building rapport through shared references and respectful acknowledgement of Japanese business traditions. Victoria began to allow herself to believe that this impossible situation might actually result in success. Then her office door burst open without warning. Brendan Walsh strode in with predatory confidence. Victoria's blood turned to ice as she realized that her competitor had arrived at precisely the worst possible moment. Brendan's presence could only mean that he was somehow involved in Morrison's disappearance, and that he'd come to witness the collapse of her most important business deal. "Victoria!" Brendan exclaimed with false cheer, his voice carrying easily to the video conference microphone. "Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know that David Morrison is safe and sound at the Plaza Hotel. He wanted me to tell you he's had a better offer." His smile was sharp and predatory as he moved into the camera frame. "I hope you haven't been trying to handle this important meeting without proper translation support. That would be unprofessional." Victoria felt her world tilting as the implications sank in. Morrison hadn't disappeared. He'd been bought. Her competitor had outbid her for the translator's services, leaving her stranded at the crucial moment. Worse, Brendan's presence here meant he knew exactly when her meeting was scheduled, suggesting corporate espionage. The Japanese executives were watching this drama unfold with expressions of growing concern. "You're letting a janitor handle your biggest deal?" Brendan continued, his voice pitched to carry maximum humiliation. "Come on, Victoria. These are serious business people, not charity cases looking for feel-good stories about the working class." His contempt was palpable, designed to undermine not just Victoria's credibility, but Jimmy's dignity as well. On the screen, Yamamoto's expression had shifted from warmth to confusion and growing displeasure. The revelation that Victoria had been using building maintenance staff as translation support clearly violated his expectations of corporate professionalism. Jimmy stepped forward, but Brendan cut him off with another calculated blow. "I'm sure Mr. Sullivan here is very nice," he said with poisonous condescension, "but Yamamoto Industries deserves better than improvised language support from the cleaning crew." The room fell silent, except for the hum of electronics and distant traffic. Victoria felt the weight of 2 years of work and hundreds of millions in potential revenue hanging in the balance. She could see the disappointment on Yamamoto's face, could feel Jimmy's pain at being reduced to a stereotype. Brendan's sabotage was working exactly as planned, but as Victoria looked at Jimmy, she saw something unexpected in his expression. Instead of shame or defeat, there was quiet resolve that reminded her of steel beneath silk. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality than she'd heard before. Less humble and more authoritative. "Mr. Walsh," he said calmly, "I think there might be some things you don't understand about this situation." He turned toward the camera, addressing Yamamoto directly in flowing Kansai dialect that carried subtle undertones of formality and respect. What Jimmy said in those next few moments transformed the entire dynamic of the room. Victoria couldn't understand the words, but she could see their effect on Yamamoto's face. Surprise giving way to interest, then to something approaching respect. Jimmy's tone was measured and dignified, carrying none of the defensive anger that Brendan's attack had been designed to provoke. Instead, he seemed to be providing context that reframed the entire situation. When Yamamoto responded with what sounded like questions rather than dismissal, Jimmy answered with fluid confidence. His responses grew longer and more complex as the conversation developed. Victoria realized that he was not just defending himself, but actively advancing the business discussion, using Brendan's attack as an opportunity to demonstrate his capabilities rather than apologize for them. "What are they saying?" Victoria asked quietly. Jimmy glanced at her briefly, his expression reassuring. "Mr. Yamamoto is asking about my background and qualifications," he said simply. "I'm explaining that sometimes the most valuable resources are hidden in unexpected places." He returned his attention to the screen, where Yamamoto was nodding thoughtfully. The next exchange lasted several minutes, with Jimmy providing what seemed to be detailed answers about his experience. Victoria noticed that his posture had changed completely. He now carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in professional settings. Whatever he was telling Yamamoto, it was having a positive effect. Brendan was growing visibly agitated as he realized his sabotage wasn't producing the desired results. "This is ridiculous," he interrupted. "You can't seriously be considering doing business with someone who uses building maintenance staff for critical negotiations?" He moved closer to the camera. "Yamamoto-san, my company has proper resources, professional translators, and established protocols." The effect of Brendan's interruption was immediate and negative, but not in the way he intended. Yamamoto's face darkened with displeasure, not at Jimmy's presence but at Brendan's rudeness and cultural insensitivity. Jimmy translated Brendan's words, but Victoria could hear the subtle changes in tone that transformed aggressive dismissal into polite disagreement. When Yamamoto responded, his voice carried cool authority. Jimmy's reply was brief and respectful, but Victoria could see satisfaction in his expression. "What did he say?" Brendan demanded. Jimmy looked at him with calm professionalism. "Mr. Yamamoto said that true partnerships are built on respect and understanding, not just resources and protocols," Jimmy translated. "He said that anyone who interrupts business meetings without invitation demonstrates poor character." The words were delivered without malice, but their impact on Brendan was devastating. Victoria felt a surge of hope as she realized that Brendan's attack had backfired spectacularly. Instead of undermining Jimmy's credibility, his cultural insensitivity had strengthened the bond between Jimmy and the Japanese executives. Yamamoto was now addressing Jimmy as an equal, their conversation flowing with ease of mutual respect. For the next 30 minutes, Jimmy conducted negotiations with skill that left Victoria speechless. He didn't just translate her company's proposals, he enhanced them, with cultural insights that made them irresistible to the Japanese mindset. When technical questions arose, he demonstrated deep understanding of both AI principles and manufacturing processes. The deal that emerged exceeded her wildest expectations, $250 million, 25% more than her original proposal. When the call ended with formal expressions of mutual respect, Victoria sat in stunned silence. Jimmy had not just saved her deal, he'd transformed it into something beyond her imagination. Brendan stood frozen in the corner, his face pale with realization that his sabotage had achieved the opposite of its intended effect. "How?" Victoria asked finally. "Who are you really?" Jimmy's smile was gentle but tinged with sadness. He sat down across from her desk, his posture now fully that of an equal. "My name is James Sullivan," he said formally. "Until 3 years ago, I was professor of comparative linguistics at Columbia University. I specialized in East Asian languages and cross-cultural business communication." The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. "What happened?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I was accused of plagiarism," Jimmy said quietly. "A colleague claimed I'd stolen research for my book. The evidence was fabricated, but it destroyed my reputation. The stress triggered my wife Sarah's heart condition. She died while I was fighting to clear my name." Victoria felt her throat tighten with sympathy. "Did you ever prove your innocence?" Jimmy's smile was bitter, but not self-pitying. "Eventually, yes, but by then it was too late. I had a dead wife and a daughter to support. This job keeps Emma and me afloat while I figure out what comes next." Brendan had been listening with growing alarm. "This is all very touching," he said with forced bravado, "but it doesn't change the fact that you've been deceiving your clients." Victoria turned toward him with an expression that could have frozen steel. "Deceiving clients? You mean like buying off my translator to sabotage a business deal?" Her voice grew sharper. "I think we need to discuss corporate espionage. Don't you think, Brendan?" The color drained from Brendan's face as he realized his tactical error. Security arrived and escorted him from the building, while Victoria turned her attention back to Jimmy. "I want to offer you a position with my company," she said. "Director of International Relations, with a salary commensurate with your experience." Jimmy's acceptance was measured but genuine, establishing boundaries while acknowledging the opportunity. 3 months later, his corner office displayed certificates from clients in 7 countries. On Sunday mornings, he brought Emma to work while Victoria stopped by with coffee and pastries, finding that success felt less lonely when shared with people who understood both achievement and struggle. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated possibilities rather than problems, transforming the Manhattan skyline into a symbol of opportunity rather than isolation. In quiet moments of recognition and possibility, Victoria had learned that the most valuable resources often came disguised as ordinary ones, waiting for someone with wisdom enough to truly see them.